Well, I'm joined by three very special guests today, each of whom has a different and unique connection to the Korean War. First is Don Taylor, a United States Marine, a Korean War veteran, and current commander of the Korean War Veterans Association of Arizona. So welcome, Don.
Thank you.
Also with us is Joel Stemple. Joel is a United States Army veteran, and although not a Korean War veteran himself, he does volunteer his time with the Korean War Veterans Association and is the current commander of the General Brad Smith Ray Harvey chapter of the Korean War Veterans Association. Joel, welcome.
Thank you.
And also with us is Susan Key, a Korean-American writer and historian who has a deep personal connection to the Korean War and with our Korean War veterans, and spends a lot of her time honoring them. So thank you for being with us,
Thank
Susan.
you for having me.
Don, I'd like to start with you and just ask you to tell us about your Korean War experience.
I was in Korea at age 20. Actually, I was worked out of Seoul, Korea, but I flew. I should say that I was an aircraft mechanic, and I flew all over Korea, the K sites at that time in a four-motored transport. We were actually in a support function. We supplied our troops. We hauled most everything. However, it was mostly troops. We did make contact with, for example, we flew mail runs to Haneda in Tokyo, and at the same time, we took care of our maintenance basically out of Seoul.
And you, when you signed up for the Marines, is that what you expected to do? Is that where you expected to go?
No, absolutely not. When I wanted to be a Marine since I was 11 years old, and I soon found out that they put you where they want you. That was the last thing in the world that I wanted to have anything to do with aviation. Later on, I went into security. However, that was for a short time period.
And how would you, when you look back on it now, how do you characterize your experience, or what do you think about when you look back on your time with the Marines in Korea?
Well, I think that I did the right thing, or perhaps they did the right thing, because why walk when you can ride? So, to me, that was very satisfying. At least I got to be a Marine. Maybe it wasn't what I wanted to be, but I did come home, and that was the main thing.
And what was it like returning home at that time?
I was overseas we didn't call it deployed in those days. I was overseas for 20 months and 3 days. It was surreal. I flew from San Francisco to Chicago, and I really didn't know what to do. It was totally different. But soon I realized I was home, and it didn't take long to actually, I ended up being stationed at Great Lakes, and 40 days later, I exited the Marine Corps to civilian life, and very happy to be here.
And at what point in your life afterward did you become involved with the Korean War Veterans Association and think about how important it was to honor those who had served in Korea, such as yourself?
Well, I actually joined other VSOs, Veteran Service Organizations, before. I was both Veterans Foreign Wars and American Legion prior to. The problem with the Korean War veterans at that time, it was the best kept secret that I'd ever see. I actually found out about it by accident, and I have been a member, I think, since 2001. However, I had joined the other VSOs long before.
And so how do you think it's important? I think the answer is yes, since you spend your time doing it, to continue to gather in camaraderie, to maybe keep the memories of the Korean War service alive?
Oh, it's something that's foremost in my mind, because to be very honest with you, we're in a survival mode. most of our veterans now are median age of 87, 88. I know Joel, he mentioned it, some of 89. I happen to be 89, and it bothers me the fact that one of these days we're going to have to dissolve some of our chapters. As a matter of fact, we already have. And in our bylaws, which we follow as close as we possibly can, if we get below 3 chapters, then we're going to have to dissolve the organization. We're trying to keep it alive now with the fact that there's been more than 3,000 men and women, mostly women, believe it or not, who have served since January 31st, 1955. So since we're in a truce mode for 68 years, since the 27th of July of 1953, they're eligible to join the Korean War Association, and we have changed it. As a matter of fact, Nationals come out with 2 different names. It's the Korean War and Service Veterans. They said that kept the women out, so we changed it, and we accepted or adopted the Korean War and Defense Veterans Association. So we have signed up a few of our defense veterans, but not nearly enough to keep this thing going.
And Susan, I'd like to turn to you, and you have a very deep personal connection to the Korean War. Can you tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, I guess simply put, I wouldn't be here without veterans like Mr. Taylor. He's the one who went to Korea to save my family from communism. And if not for our Korean War veterans, there's no way that any of us Koreans who live in freedom from North Korea's communist regime could be here. So I owe my life and my freedoms to all of our Korean War veterans and all those who never came home, the fallen heroes, and those who are still missing from the Korean War. So to me, it's a very personal connection because every day I realize I am alive and free because of our Korean War veterans. My mom was about 9 years old, and my dad was about 17 when the war started. So the war is not too far from my understanding of what happened in my birth country. I was born 13 years after the war, and Korea was still very poor in the 60s. So the war was always talked about in my family, and their stories have been handed down to me, and we've never forgotten that we were saved from such an evil and tyrannical regime that still exists today in North Korea. So if Americans and other United Nations countries had not come to save us, I know that South Korea would have been swallowed by North Korean communist regime, and I wouldn't be standing here or sitting here with you today. So I am so devoted to looking for veterans to thank because I think that it's never too late to thank them. And I know that the Korean War is always talked about as the forgotten war. And I don't like hearing that because for our family and all the veterans who fought and the families who lost loved ones in the Korean War, it's never going to be forgotten. So, so it is my passion now to make sure that people understand the legacy of our Korean War veterans, that they have given freedom to millions of Koreans like me. And so I will keep telling that story until everyone really understands the gravity of what our Korean War veterans have done. They saved a country and a people from communism.
And tell us more about how you are going about telling those stories.
Well, it started, first of all, with my first meeting in Peoria, meeting the West Valley chapter. That was my very first time meeting Korean War veterans for the very first time. And I was so humbled and embarrassed because I had lived most of my corporate life. I was in corporate world, not thinking about Korean War veterans, living here as an immigrant. And here I saw all 80-year-old veterans in walkers and wheelchairs and canes, and I thought, wow, I've lived my whole life here in America without recognizing this is where they are. And they're the ones that gave me my life. And so I felt so humbled and so embarrassed, but also grateful to meet them finally. And so that was a journey that I started 9 years ago. And I'm grateful every day and every time I meet a Korean War veteran because they're all heroes to me.
And you share their stories, their personal stories.
Yes. So,
via
I'm
your
sorry,
Facebook
I didn't answer
page.
that question. So when I started meeting the veterans, they started telling me their stories and showing me photos of Korea and telling me places I never even heard of in Korea. And I thought, wow, they're the best Korean War history teachers. So I started just sitting down with them and taping their interview and interviewing them, asking them their stories. And they would bring out maps and photos and really educate me. And so everything that I have learned, I've started to put on Facebook, on social media, because I wanted to share what I have received from the veterans and to educate the public about the Korean War and their legacy. So it's become a really exciting journey that I never thought I would be taking. And to be even next to Mr. Taylor and to be able to give him a call and just talk to him as someone of a friend is really amazing, because he's a hero. And I know so many heroes in my life. And I'm so grateful for this journey that I did not plan on, that God led me to.
And it seems, in looking at your Facebook page and the posts, it seems the public reaction is very positive, and
yes.
people really sharing that enthusiasm.
Yes, I think there's a lot of people who are wanting to learn about the Korean War because they have family members who served in the Korean War. During the Korean War, about 1.9 million Americans served. And so that's a very big number. And there's a lot of children and relatives of those that served and those who gave their lives. So there's a curiosity about the Korean War. And so they're seeking information. And that's how I think I have drawn a lot of people who are wanting to learn more about the history and the personal stories of our veterans.
Well, it's great to see, and we really appreciate the work you're doing there. I'd like to talk to you, Joel, a little bit as someone who is not yourself a Korean War veteran. You also have a personal connection, and you told me a story earlier of kind of when that connection began.
Right. I grew up in Virginia, and on June 25th, 1950, I was not quite eight years old. And I was driving with my dad, and we listened to the radio, and President Truman came on and said that North Korea invaded South Korea, and it was a very serious situation. So I asked my dad, I said, "Where's Korea?" He says, "It's in Asia, I think." And I said, "Well," and so we talked a little bit, and so when I got home, I used an encyclopedia, which we not used to seeing anymore. And I looked up Korea, and I was interested in it, and I started following it. And my dad told me, he said, when I was 7 years old, he said, you ought to start reading the newspaper. I never thought about it, so I started reading the newspaper, and I followed the Korean War that way, and all the way through, and that's how I learned about it.
And you subsequently served in the Army yourself
Right.
in the 60s.
In the 60s, I was in Germany.
And do you think that your experience as a young boy with the Korean War beginning, do you think that maybe planted the seed for you wanting to serve in the Army?
Absolutely. Absolutely. I wanted to be a Marine, but I knew that wasn't going to happen because I wore glasses, and at that time the Marines didn't take people with glasses. So I went into college, and my dad told me, he says, always better to go in as an officer. And so I joined ROTC, and I got commissioned when I graduated in 1963, and I served in Germany for 2 years in the Quartermaster Corps. I got out as a first lieutenant.
And so tell us how you came to be a member of the Korean War Veterans Association.
That's interesting. One of my friends is a Korean War veteran, and he said, "Would you go with me?" He was kind of shy. I'm going on this thing, and I said, "Yeah, sure, I'll go." So I went, and it was very, very welcoming and very nice. And I got up and I said, "You probably have to." When I introduced myself, I said, "I'll have to tell you I was an officer," and all the guys looked at me. But anyway, and then it was a lot of camaraderie, a lot of history. People were very, very nice, and they accepted me. And then about 2 years after I went there, I joined it, and I paid my dues, and the commander left. And so they asked me if I wanted to be the commander. And the reason that they did is I'm about 10 years younger than most of the others in there, and no one wanted it. So I did. I took over as commander, and I think I've been doing it for 4 years. And it's been very satisfying. The people that I've known and I've worked with are just absolutely terrific, and just really, really nice people. And unfortunately, during the last 18 months, we've lost about seven people, but they all related their experiences. We have some stories that you wouldn't believe, and maybe when we start over in September and some of those people come back from the north, I can have them come and give you an interview that will just blow your socks off.
Well, I think it's incredibly important for people to share those stories, and I think it's great that you are helping a group of them meet and do that. Don, I want to turn back to you. Do you have opportunities now to reflect back, hearing a personal story like Susan's, to really kind of reflect back on the legacy of yourself and the others in the United States Armed Services who served in Korea? Do you think about what that really means?
Absolutely. The South Korean people they actually can't do enough for us. They are so appreciative of what we did at that time. And you have to be a Korean veteran to realize exactly how much they do for us. And we thank you, Susan. And you know, every Korean veteran that we talk to says the same thing about South Korea. We did the right thing, and of course, I'm not able right now at my age, but I'd do it again.
Well, Susan, he talked about that legacy, and it's been a long time ago. How do you think people living in America now understand it, or do they understand it?
I think most people don't have any clue about the Korean War. All they know is about World War II and Vietnam, and that's very little. And schools right now, I think, are teaching very little about history as it is with military history. So Korea sits right in the middle of World War II and Vietnam, and it's always been in the shadows. And I think that's a primary reason why it's forgotten. So that is why, one of the reasons why I decided to go on social media to reach a lot of people with Korean War history from the perspective of the veterans that I meet and interview, and then from the perspective of Korean person who is here testifying to what they gave us, our freedoms. So I felt it was very important to put the voice of the Korean people with gratitude and honor for our American veterans.
And you've also subsequently done some work with Gold Star families as well. And you and I were talking earlier, but can you tell us the story of Major Storms and his return?
Yes. So Major Harvey Storms was a major in the U.S. Army. He had served under General Patton in World War II in Italy. And his family had been assigned to Japan for occupation duties after World War II. And then the Korean War broke out. And so he, at the time, had 3 young sons, the oldest being 9 years old, and his wife was also pregnant with their 4th. And so the son is who I know, Mr. Sam Storms, the oldest son. He was only 9 when they parted ways at a train station in Tokyo in the summer of 1950 after the Korean War broke out. And he remembers his dad walking off and just looking back at Sam, little Sam, and giving him this look, just really strange look in his eyes. And that's the last time he saw him. So the family decided to return to Texas while he was serving in Korea. And then the following spring is when they received a telegram with a knock on the door. The U.S. military sent 2 men to inform Mrs. Storms that he was missing in North Korea. The way the family relates the story is just really heartbreaking. So after the 2 men left, Mrs. Storms went into the kitchen, and little Sam followed her into the kitchen. And she kind of took a long pause, and she looked at Sam and said, "Now, what are we going to do, Sam?" And then she said, "But God will take care of us." And so she had such an inner strength and faith in God to take care of them. And she was still pregnant. And Mr. Sam Storms remembers his mom sitting on her knees every morning praying, and praying for God's wisdom to raise these 4 boys on her own. And what's happened is, fast forward 70 years, it was in 2019 I'm sorry, I should go back to 2018. 2018, you remember, after the President Trump and Kim had a summit in Singapore, North Korea decided to return 55 caskets of Americans' remains from the Korean War. And there was a big ceremony with Vice President Mike Pence in Hickam Air Force Base in Honolulu. So all the families were watching this, wondering whose remains are we going to find in these 55 caskets? Well, Mr. Sam Storms got a call from DPAA, which is the Defense POW MIA Accounting Agency. And he said it was so emotional, he had to pull off the road. He was driving, and he said he just cried that his daddy's finally coming home. So Major Storms was supposed to be buried in 2020, but because of the pandemic, they delayed his funeral to this year. So I will be joining the family in July as we lay him to rest at Arlington. So I always think about the lifelong pain these families have carried. And I always wear my POW MIA pin whenever I do events for veterans, because these are the heroes that are still missing, that we need to think about and remember these families who are still experiencing the war. They have never been able to put the Korean War aside. They're living in the Korean War every day as they're wondering about where are their loved ones, what happened to them. So there are still about 7,700 Americans missing. So since the war to today, only about 500 have been recovered and identified. So we have a long ways to go. North Korea is still holding about what we believe about 5,300 Americans that have fallen in battle or in prison camps or other places. So we still have quite a few 5,300 Americans still missing in North Korea. So my heart breaks for them because I am here alive and free, but they made the sacrifice and their loved ones are trapped somewhere in North Korea. So to me, it's a very personal burden I feel as well, that they made this tremendous sacrifice that I will never be able to repay.
And have you connected with other Korean Americans who share the same perspective and passion?
Yes, there's actually quite a lot of Korean Americans around the country that are doing various things. There's a lady in Alabama who started a foundation, and she does an annual luncheon for Korean War veterans in Huntsville. So Mrs. Bertling does a great job of that. There's other key people here and there. They're not necessarily known, but I've come to know a lot of different Korean Americans across the country that care about our veterans and also belong to Korean War veterans groups and do things with the veterans. So I'm certainly not alone in this, but we definitely need more Korean Americans to become aware and care for our veterans while we have them.
Certainly. And certainly we've really, I think, just brushed the surface of an incredible topic, and you touched on the thousands and thousands and thousands of stories there are that you're helping to tell. This question is really for all three of you, but what would you ask people who see this to do to honor those who served in the Korean War? Don, I'll start with you.
That's a great question. I would like to see him just do what Susan and her group has been doing. And as I said before, they have done so much for us. I don't think they can do too much more, to be honest.
And what about you, Joel?
Susan and I have worked very closely together with a lot of these activities. And as a matter of fact, what I'd like to mention, may not be directly answering your question, is that Susan was the recipient of the Copper Sword Award, which was put out by the Arizona Heroes Association, I believe. Is that what it is?
Arizona Veterans Hall of Fame.
Arizona Veterans Hall of Fame. And that was for people who are not military, but are citizens that help and recognize and tell the story of veterans and how to help them. And it's just been really amazing how much I've learned from Susan in the last 4 years, I guess we've been working together.
Well, I think I like to kind of retract that. I think all the honor goes to our veterans. really the right order of things is our veterans are the reason why I am here. And nothing I do is worthy of any attention, really, because I wouldn't be here without the veterans. And so to me, I just feel like I am doing what is right and long overdue to our veterans. It is the people who have been saved that need to thank our veterans. And to me, that's just basic. That is just basic. And that's such a small thing we're doing. But I think that's an important thing, is to learn the stories of the veterans. So I think you asked, well, what can the public do? I would say develop a curiosity about the Korean War. Go find Korean War veterans. Ask them their stories, capture their stories. If you have a Korean War veteran in your family, an uncle or father, please ask them, because I know our Korean War veterans have long kept their mouth closed about the war. But I think part of it is because they don't see that anyone is interested. So I think if someone is interested enough to ask, I think they would be willing to tell their story. And that's the history, the personal history, and the legacy we need to remember. And that's how we honor them for generations from now, is to learn their stories, to pass it on, and to make sure that America doesn't forget the great legacy of our Korean War veterans. They saved South Korea and millions of Koreans who are here today. South Korea is now the 10th largest economy in the world. How does that happen? We were the poorest country during Korean War. This is a miracle on earth. And the fact that our Korean War veterans, with very little support, at that time Truman had downsized the military, that they fought this vicious war and was able to push back the communists back to North Korea and save South Korea is a very big story and a very big deal that we should never forget. So I really hope that everyone, anyone out there would develop a curiosity, seek out stories, learn, and if you're a Korean American, definitely do something, anything to honor and show your appreciation to our veterans.
May I add something to that?
Please.
As Kelly and we all recognize that I'm not a Korean War veteran, but I support them and I'm the commander of a unit. Well, I have a shirt here that says Commander Korean War Veterans. I seldom go into a store after a meeting or something when I wear this where someone said, gee, I had an uncle in the Korean War, or my grandfather was in the Korean War, or somebody was in the Korean War. So it is more known, I think, but people don't relate it to the veterans so much what they did. They know that their relatives were in the Korean War. And this is what's so important about what you are doing. And thank you.
I wouldn't be here without our veterans. So,
Susan, can you tell us the
Yes.
name of your Facebook page so people could go and
Yes.
read some of these stories?
Yes, my Facebook page is Susan Key Honoring Korean War Veterans.
And we'll share that on the screen for
Thank
our
you so
viewers as
much.
well. But we also release this as a podcast. So for those who are listening in their cars or while they're working around the house, please give that page a visit. I just want to thank each of you. This has been a wonderful conversation, and we hope that that this gives a little bit more attention to a group of very, very worthy veterans, Don and your colleagues who served in the Korean War. So thank you for your service, and thank you, each of you, for what you're doing to honor our Korean War veterans.
Well, thank you
Thank you.
for
Thank you so
inviting
much.
us.
Appreciate it.
It's been,
Thank you.
it's been a pleasure.
It was
an
certainly
honor.
my honor.
Thank you.
You.